All right, so let's dive right in. We're doing a deep dive today into software professionalism with The Clean Coder by Robert C. Martin.
Oh, yeah, Uncle Bob.
Uncle Bob,
Yeah.
exactly. And we're going way beyond the code itself. Like, what really makes a software developer a professional?
Yeah.
Not just somebody who can, sling some code around.
Well, and he doesn't shy away from the tough questions in this book. Like, right off the bat, he kind of digs into that perception that software development is not seen as a real profession, in the way that maybe like being a doctor or a lawyer is.
Yeah, and he kicks it off with a story that kind of highlights that exact problem. It's about this super intense project he was on. And he and his colleague were just, really pushing the engineering team hard to meet deadlines. But then, like, the same colleague totally flipped a switch when interacting with the legal team.
Oh, interesting.
Like, treated them with a totally different level of respect, like they were the real deal professionals and the engineers weren't quite there yet.
Interesting. So it's like this inherent bias almost.
Right.
That other professions are somehow more legitimate.
Right. And have you ever run into that kind of thinking yourself?
Oh, absolutely. Especially, early in my career. It always felt like we were the code monkeys and not really, contributing to the bigger picture.
Yeah, yeah. Like our work wasn't seen as requiring the same level of expertise and responsibility.
Exactly, exactly. And that's what Uncle Bob really tackles head on, right? He lays out this core principle. First, do no harm.
Okay, first, do no harm. Now, for doctors, it's all about, like, patient well-being. But what does harm actually look like in software?
Right.
Buggy code, sure. But is there more to it?
Yeah, I mean, think about code that's so convoluted that nobody can understand it.
Yeah.
It might work right now, but the second you need to make changes, it becomes an absolute nightmare. Or code that's, like, super rigid and breaks every time you add a new feature. That's You're harming the project in the long run.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I've definitely been there. Rushed a feature once, skipped some testing just to hit a deadline, and QA was not happy about it.
Yeah.
To say the least.
That's like unintentional harm, though.
Don't
But
get
it still has consequences, right? Not testing thoroughly leads to those bugs that come back to bite you later. It costs time and money to fix them.
For sure.
And a true professional, Uncle Bob argues, they own that responsibility, and part of that responsibility is knowing when to say no.
Ooh, there's a skill right there.
Big time.
Saying no. And he tells this crazy story about this Gorilla Mart app where the client just kept piling on features, pushing the deadlines further and further.
Mm-hmm.
Did that one resonate with you at all?
Oh, I think that's resonated with like pretty much every developer I know.
Right.
You end up working crazy hours compromising on quality. The project was ultimately canceled in that case.
Oof.
It's a classic example of why saying no is so crucial.
But how do you actually say no without coming across as, like, not a team player? Or worse, like risking your job?
Right. It's a tough one. Well, Uncle Bob gets really tactical about this. Like, he actually tells you how to frame your no in a professional way. Instead of just saying, I can't, you could say something like, prioritizing this new feature means we'll have to push back delivery by X weeks. Is that trade-off okay with you?
Well, that's good.
Right. So you're putting the decision back in their court.
Yeah.
But you're basing it on facts, not just saying, oh, I'm too busy.
You're thinking strategically.
Exactly.
Not just reacting. That's brilliant. Now, speaking of strategy, he's also a big advocate for the 60-hour work week. 40 for your employer, 20 for your career. That sounds intense.
It does, and I don't think it's necessarily about literally hitting 60 hours every week.
Okay.
But the principle is key. Professionals invest in their own growth.
So, like, what would that look like?
Okay, so say you're interested in, I don't know, AI.
Hmm.
You might dedicate a couple of hours every week to exploring TensorFlow tutorials or something like that.
Oh, I see.
Even if you don't hit 60 hours, the idea is to make time for that continuous learning.
Right.
It's not just about your current job, it's about building that long-term career.
So it's like an investment in your future self. I like that.
Exactly.
But Uncle Bob also has this massive list of concepts that he says every pro should know. Design patterns, principles, methods, specific tools. It's kind of overwhelming, honestly.
It is a lot. But let's just focus on one that I think is particularly powerful. Test-driven development. TDD. Have you played around with that at all?
I've dabbled. I haven't fully committed. What makes it so important, especially in the context of, professionalism?
Well, think about it this way. You write the test before you write the code. This forces you to think through the problem really thoroughly and define exactly what done means. It's not just about catching bugs, it's about designing better code from the very beginning.
Okay, so it's not just a technical practice. It's more of like a mindset shift.
Right, exactly. It's about being more thoughtful, more proactive.
I like that. But speaking of proactive, how does Uncle Bob suggest we manage our time? Because I'm already juggling a million projects and deadlines. Adding another 20 hours of self-study on top of that seems impossible.
It's a challenge, for sure. He actually has this whole system. He works in 15-minute blocks, focusing on his most important tasks first thing in the morning. Now, you might not need to go that granular.
Hold on, 15 minutes. That's like the Pomodoro technique on steroids.
Right. But the principle is what matters. Be intentional with your time.
Okay, so what stood out to you from his approach?
Well, I really connected with the idea of front-loading that focused work. Like, I'm definitely most productive in the morning.
Same here.
But then meetings, they can just completely drain your time.
Oh, tell me about it. Meetings are like the bane of my existence.
So how does Uncle Bob deal with that? Well, he's actually pretty radical. He says you are not obligated to attend every single meeting.
Wait, really? You can just decline meetings?
Yeah.
What if it's like your boss inviting you?
It's not about being, rude or dismissive. It's recognizing that your time is valuable. And if a meeting isn't directly relevant to your work, or, maybe your input isn't crucial, you can politely decline.
Okay.
Or suggest alternative ways to share information, like, hey, I'm heads down on the X project right now. Can someone just send me the notes afterward?
That's smart. Setting boundaries, but professionally. I like that.
Exactly. Now, what about those unproductive arguments? The ones that can just hijack a meeting.
Yeah. I've lost hours of my life to those, it feels like sometimes.
Well, Uncle Bob has a surprisingly simple solution. Each person gets to present their case concisely. Then you take a vote and boom, move on.
Wow, that's efficient.
No endless debates. Speaking of draining energy, though, he also talks about this concept of focus mana.
Focus mana. What is that? Like some kind of productivity potion?
Not quite. Think of it as your mental energy for that deep, focused work. You only have a limited supply each day.
Okay. Yeah, that tracks.
And certain things drain it faster than others, like debugging for hours, stressful meetings, even just being tired.
Totally.
So knowing how to replenish your focus mana is key.
So besides the obvious, like getting enough sleep, what are some ways to refill that mental energy tank?
Well, Uncle Bob recommends taking breaks to do things that don't require that intense focus. So a short walk, a chat with a colleague, even just staring out the window for a few minutes.
Interesting.
Do you find that helps in your own work?
Absolutely. Sometimes I get so stuck on a problem, I just need to step away. Like clearing my head for even a few minutes makes a huge difference. It's like hitting the reset button on my brain. But even with the best time management strategies, software development is rarely a solo sport.
Definitely not.
And Uncle Bob is a big proponent of collaboration.
Huge. And he highlights a problem that I think is unfortunately really common.
What's that?
Code ownership silos.
Oh, yeah.
It's that mentality where developers get so protective of their code that they don't want anyone else to touch it.
Oh, I've seen that. It's like everyone's building their own little kingdom.
Right, and they don't want any invaders. But that can't be good for the project overall.
No, not at all.
It leads to these knowledge silos, where only one person understands a specific part of the system.
Makes it harder to make changes, fix bugs.
Exactly. And it's a huge risk if that person, leaves the team.
It's like a single point of failure, just waiting to happen. So how does Uncle Bob suggest we break down these silos?
Well, he is a massive advocate for pair programming.
Okay, pair programming. Interesting.
He sees it as more than just a technique. It's a way to build better software and better teams. You're constantly sharing knowledge, reviewing each other's code in real time, catching those errors early.
Okay, I can see the benefits there. But I've also heard some developers say that pair programming actually slows them down. Like two people doing the work of one. How do you address that?
Yeah, it's true. Initially, you might write code a bit slower.
Okay.
But the quality is often much, much higher. You spend less time debugging and fixing errors later.
Makes sense.
Plus, you've got that knowledge sharing, better code reviews. It can actually lead to faster progress overall in the long run. What are your thoughts on pair programming? Have you found it to be effective?
I've had kind of mixed experiences. Sometimes it's fantastic. We just click and the code flows. Other times it feels like we're stepping on each other's toes.
I get that. I think it depends a lot on personalities and whether you have a shared understanding of the task at hand. And Uncle Bob acknowledges that it's not about pairing all the time. There are definitely times when solo work is appropriate. But he encourages it, especially for those complex tasks or when knowledge transfer is important.
So it's about choosing the right tool for the job. Sometimes it's a pair of programmers, sometimes it's a solo mission. Now, speaking of tools, Uncle Bob also has a lot to say about the actual tools we use, right? He even has that whole appendix dedicated to his personal toolkit.
He does. And it's not just about the specific tools themselves, it's about understanding their purpose and how to use them effectively. So he talks about source control, issue management, continuous build systems. It's about building that professional workflow.
Let's start with source control. He's a big fan of Git.
Yeah. Big Git advocate.
But what makes it so essential from a professional standpoint?
Well, for one, it's distributed. So you can work offline and sync up your changes later, which is great for flexibility. But the real power is in tracking those changes, collaborating effectively, and being able to easily revert to previous versions if something goes wrong. It's like having a time machine for your code.
I've definitely seen the value of good source control. Early in my career, I worked on a project without it.
Oh, no.
It was an absolute nightmare, trying to keep track of changes, merging code. It was just chaos.
Yeah, essential for any serious project, especially with multiple developers. And then you've got issue management, which Uncle Bob also emphasizes.
Okay, issue management. Tell me about that.
So tools like Jira or Trello, they provide that central place to track bugs, feature requests, tasks, you name it.
Okay.
Helps you prioritize work, track progress, make sure nothing falls through the cracks. It's like a shared to-do list on steroids.
Oh, I like that. A shared to-do list on steroids. Especially for larger teams, I can see how that would be invaluable.
Absolutely. Keeps everyone on the same page. And then there's continuous build systems, which Uncle Bob is a big advocate for.
Like Jenkins or Circle CI.
Exactly. They automate the process of building, testing, and deploying software. It's like having a dedicated QA team continuously monitoring the code base. Acts as a safety net to catch those errors early.
That sounds incredibly efficient.
It is. Now, shifting gears a bit, what about IDEs? Uncle Bob is a fan of IntelliJ IDEA, right?
Yeah, he mentions it specifically, but what features does he highlight as being essential for, professionals?
He praises IntelliJ for its intuitive interface and powerful features, but the core things apply to any good IDE. Code completion, syntax highlighting, refactoring tools, debugging capabilities, integration with testing frameworks. It's like having a superpower for coding.
I love that. A superpower for coding. A good IDE can definitely make development so much more enjoyable and productive.
Exactly. But he's also cautious about getting caught up in the hype of the latest and greatest tools. He says, choose tools that are appropriate for the job. Don't just blindly follow trends.
Be pragmatic. Speaking of pragmatism, let's talk about testing. Uncle Bob is a huge advocate for automated testing.
Oh, yeah. Especially test-driven development.
Right, right. He believes it's not just about catching bugs, it's about designing better code from the start. Remember that test automation pyramid we talked about earlier?
With the unit tests at the bottom, then component tests, integration tests, and finally, system tests at the top.
Right, right. Great framework for thinking about the different levels of testing. But with so many different testing frameworks out there, how does a professional developer know which ones to choose?
Well, it depends on the project and the tech stack, of course.
Right.
But Uncle Bob emphasizes choosing tools that are widely used, well-documented, and easy to integrate into your workflow. Like for unit testing in Java, Jonit is a popular choice.
Makes sense. And he stresses the importance of integrating those automated tests into your continuous build system.
Absolutely. So they run every time code is committed. You're building that safety net, catching errors before they can do any real damage. But even with the best tools and processes, software development is ultimately a human endeavor, right?
Oh, 100%. At the end of the day, it's people building software for other people.
Exactly. And Uncle Bob dedicates a significant portion of the book to this human side of the craft. He's very vocal about the importance of clear communication.
Especially when it comes to, requirements and estimates, right?
Right. He stresses the need to avoid ambiguity and make sure everyone is on the same page. Techniques like automated acceptance tests can really help with that, too.
Yeah, having that shared understanding between the development team and the stakeholders. So important.
Miscommunication is a recipe for disaster. Missed deadlines, costly mistakes, frustration.
Oh, yeah. It can derail a project so quickly. And it's not just communication between developers and stakeholders, it's also communication among the developers themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Code reviews, pair programming, regular team meetings all contribute to a more communicative and collaborative environment.
It's not just about talking at each other.
Right.
It's about actively listening and understanding each other's perspectives. Now, what about those situations where conflict arises? How does Uncle Bob suggest we handle those?
Ooh, good question. Conflict is inevitable, right? Especially
Oh,
when you're working closely with others.
he advocates for open and respectful communication, addressing the conflict directly but constructively.
Okay, so no passive-aggressive emails or snarky comments in code reviews.
He actually calls passive aggression one of the most damaging behaviors in a team, creates distrust and resentment, which can really poison the whole team dynamic. It's far more effective to just address the conflict directly, respectfully, even if it feels a little uncomfortable.
That takes courage and maturity and probably a healthy dose of empathy.
It does. And speaking of human fallibility, Uncle Bob also talks about the importance of learning from our mistakes.
Oh, we all make them right.
All the time. He sees mistakes as opportunities for growth. He encourages developers to be open about their errors, share what they learned. He even advocates for this blameless post-mortem culture.
Interesting. Tell me more about that.
So the focus is on understanding what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again, rather than just pointing fingers.
Oh, I like that. That creates such a healthier environment.
It acknowledges that we're all human, we all make mistakes. The key is to learn from them and move forward. And speaking of moving forward, Uncle Bob also spends a lot of time on professional development.
Right. He has a whole chapter dedicated to that.
He highlights the importance of continuous learning, practicing your craft, staying up to date. He actually recommends spending 20 hours a week on professional development.
Whoa, 20 hours. That seems like a lot, especially on top of a full-time job.
It is a big commitment, he acknowledges that, but the principle is what matters. Even if you can't dedicate a full 20 hours, making time for activities that help you grow as a developer is crucial.
So, like, what kind of activities?
Reading books and articles, attending conferences, working on side projects, contributing to open source, all of that.
So it's really about recognizing that learning is an ongoing process. It doesn't just end when you graduate or land your first job.
Exactly. The software world is constantly changing, so we have to be constantly learning and growing if we want to stay relevant. He also recommends focusing on the fundamentals.
The fundamentals.
Yeah, because, specific tools and technologies might change, but the underlying principles of good software development, those remain constant.
So things like clean code, solid principles, design patterns, those are the building blocks that will serve you well no matter what the latest trends are.
Exactly. Once you have that solid foundation, it's much easier to pick up new things, adapt to those changing technologies. You've got that mental framework.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Adaptability is key in the software world for sure. What are some things you do to stay current and keep learning?
Well, I try to carve out a few hours every week to just read blog posts, articles, stay up on what's happening. And I found that personal projects, even small ones, are a great way to experiment with new technologies, stretch my skills a bit.
Oh, I love that. Personal projects are so much fun.
They are, and Uncle Bob would definitely approve. He talks about deliberate practice, where you focus on specific skills or techniques that you want to improve. So that could be working through coding katas, contributing to open source. It's about pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone and actively honing your skills.
Oh, it's like the difference between just playing a sport and actually training to improve.
Exactly. But with so much information out there, it's easy to get overwhelmed, right?
Yeah, totally. It's like you're constantly playing catch up.
Uncle Bob says focus on the fundamentals, which is great advice. But I'd also add that you need to be selective about the information you consume. Don't try to learn everything at once. Pick a few areas you're genuinely interested in and really dive deep.
Quality over quantity.
Exactly. And be patient with yourself. You can't master everything overnight. It's a journey.
I love that. Learning is a journey, not a destination.
Right. And it should be something we enjoy, not something that stresses us out. But speaking of the bigger picture, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier. Why do you think software developers aren't always seen as professionals in the same way that, say, doctors or lawyers are? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's a complex issue. Part of it might be that software development is a relatively young field.
That's true.
We're still figuring out what it means to be a professional. And there isn't really one agreed-upon definition or a standardized path like you see in medicine or law.
That's a really good point. And unlike those professions, there's no licensing or certification required to be a software developer, right?
Right.
So that can lead to some inconsistency in terms of quality and professionalism, makes it harder for clients and employers to know what to expect, and maybe even harder for developers themselves to know what standards to hold themselves to.
Which is why books like The Clean Coder are so valuable, I think. They provide that framework for thinking about professionalism. and they offer practical guidance on how to develop those essential skills and habits.
Absolutely. It's like a guidebook for navigating the sometimes very messy world of software. And the more developers who embrace these principles of craftsmanship, the more we can elevate the perception of our profession.
So how do we actually change that perception? How do we, show the world that software developers are true professionals?
Well, I think it starts with each of us taking responsibility for our own professionalism.
Right.
Like, we need to hold ourselves to high standards, right? Writing clean code, communicating clearly, collaborating respectfully, and always pushing ourselves to learn and grow.
It's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. But I also think it's about advocating for our profession and showing the value that we bring to the table.
Okay, yeah. Like how?
Speaking at conferences, writing articles, mentoring others, those are all ways to kind of shift that perception and show that software development is a legitimate, profession.
It's about showcasing all the incredible things that software developers can do.
Exactly.
And as we do that, we start to earn that respect, that recognition. Now, Uncle Bob also talks about this idea of needing a more structured approach to training and development, something like a formal apprenticeship system. Do you think that would help raise the bar for professionalism?
Oh, I think that would be huge. Right now it often feels like we just kind of throw new grads into the deep end and say, sink or swim.
Yeah.
A more formalized system where you have those experienced mentors guiding and supporting those who are just starting out, that would benefit everyone, not just the new grads, but the entire industry.
Right. It would help new grads get up to speed faster.
Yeah.
But it would also raise that overall level of professionalism across the board.
Exactly.
And it's not just about technical skills, right? It's about instilling those core values that Uncle Bob keeps talking about: craftsmanship, responsibility, collaboration, and even lays out a whole system with different levels: apprentices, journeymen, masters. It reminds me of the guild system from like medieval times.
Oh, it's a great analogy.
So the apprentices are those just starting out, eager to learn, but needing that guidance.
Right.
Journeymen have a solid foundation. They can take on more responsibility. They can even start mentoring others. And then you have the masters, the ones with that exceptional expertise who guide and shape the next generation of developers.
It's about passing down that craftsmanship meme, as Uncle Bob calls it, ensuring that the knowledge and the best practices are shared and preserved.
That's a powerful vision. But how do we actually make it a reality? Because it sounds like it would require a massive shift in how the industry operates.
It would. It would take a collective effort from companies, educational institutions, and individual developers, really.
So companies would need to invest in training programs, create those opportunities for mentorship.
Right.
Schools would need to adapt their curricula to better align with what the industry actually needs. And developers themselves would need to embrace that responsibility of sharing their knowledge and experience.
Yeah, it's a tall order. But if we all recognize the value that it would bring,
Right.
I think it's achievable. Imagine the impact it would have on code quality, project success rates, developer
That's a
satisfaction.
vision worth striving for.
Yeah,
And I think Uncle Bob lays out a really compelling roadmap for us in the Clean Coder.
he does. And I think this deep dive has really only scratched the surface of what the book has to offer.
It's been an awesome journey. We've covered so much ground. We talked about the mindset of a professional, the importance of saying no, the power of TDD, strategies for managing your time and your focus, and so much more.
We explored those essential tools and techniques, from source control to continuous integration, and we even dove into the human side of software development: collaboration, communication, conflict resolution.
And we touched on that bigger picture of how we can raise the bar for professionalism in the software industry and really start to get that respect and recognition that we deserve.
The Clean Coder is a real call to action, a challenge for each of us to step up and embrace what it truly means to be a professional in the world of software development.
It's been inspiring, honestly, and I hope you're feeling as energized as I am to continue this conversation. So we want to hear from you. What resonated with you most from our discussion today? What are your thoughts on raising the bar for professionalism in the software industry? Share your insights on social media. We'd love to keep this conversation going. And until next time, keep coding clean.